Much gratitude for joining us today, and welcome to the John Minnie podcast, where we explore all things urban horticulture, indoors and out, through the perspectives of the many amazing people who have made it their career. I'm your host, Mark Minnie, president of John Minnie Distinctive Landscapes, and at John Minnie, our purpose is to make places beautiful by bringing nature to the places people live, work, and play. Today, I sit down with Matthew Spencer, a designer at John Minnie, and today's episode will be a project spotlight on a rooftop garden design build in New York City. Matt, the lead designer on the project, is going to focus on the design process and the role of renderings in the design of urban landscapes. We'll discuss some of the imaging and software he utilized. We'll talk about the general pros and cons of using renderings in the development of landscapes. And then there's some interesting digressions, such as how constraints can breed creativity and how critical it is to build a rapport with your clients so that you receive candid feedback through the design process. All right, without further ado, let's head over to my conversation with Matt. Matt, welcome to the John Minnie podcast.
Thank you.
So I'm pumped to have you on today. You're a teammate of mine, so I enjoy collaborating with you. I know you're wildly talented. So I'm pumped to have you here. What we'll be featuring is a project spotlight, Zero Irving in New York City, a project you worked on. We were just talking offline a few seconds ago. I know it started several years ago.
Yeah.
And we'll be focusing on the role of renderings in the development of this urban landscape. But why don't you start off by giving some context on the project? How did we get involved and the scope?
Sure. Yeah. So this project started, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago now. Lucas, one of our former teammates, had a relationship with RAL companies who do a lot of work in the city. The scope of the project was a new build right at Zero Irving, so right next to Union Square. Beautiful building. They had it fully rendered out, and it's a multi-use property, so mostly office space, but I think the bottom couple floors were restaurants for public use and things like that. But our scope, at least at the beginning, was fully for a rooftop garden. Super cool space. I think the roof was 6,000 square feet or so.
Cool.
Had great views, looking both ways. And yeah, a lot of cool stuff on the building before we even got involved. They had this photovoltaic roof that was designed to, take in a lot of light and then put out light at night that kind of matched the colors of the facade. So a lot of fun and interesting things that we had to take into consideration.
Cool. So the scope of the project is design development of a landscape on the roof, and accessed by all tenants, or is it like a?
So I believe it's accessed by all tenants. I think it was like an amenity space for the building. I know there was kind of talks going back and forth on that through the process, but I think that's what they landed on.
Cool. So we got involved over 4 years ago, you said?
Yeah.
Yep. When did what was like the total duration of like when we first got involved speaking with the customer and when the landscape came to fruition?
So I want to say 2 years, just about 2 or 3 years.
2 years, yeah. Cool.
When I first went there. So I'd say about 2 years, the turnaround altogether.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I like to ask that question when we do project spotlights on this podcast, because it just puts into context like that, interesting urban landscapes don't like come to fruition overnight. Like sometimes people think like, you're just gonna install a garden or like put a garden in,
just do it.
Yeah, but like and you're like 2 years, like maybe short, I'm like, people don't think like, there's 2 years of sweat equity that goes into it. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's crazy because I think 2 years is short. A lot of things in our field take much longer. And I think by the nature of what we do at John Minnie, a lot of it is a little quicker turnaround. Of course, depending on the project, but it's it's been an interesting and fun part of it. It's not like I'm doing CAD drawings on something that's 10 years out. I mean, sure, there are projects that are like that, but a lot of the time I wouldn't call it rapid fire, but in the grand
Yeah.
scheme of things, it is, in construction stuff.
So, all right. So, can you give like a little background on like what your specific role was in this project? Was it
Yeah,
like a team
so
approach, and
yeah,
what your
so
role was?
Lucas and I worked
Cool.
together on this one. This was when I had swapped over from design into sales fully. Um, and Lucas was handling most of the construction side of things. He was working with our estimating department, um, while I was, handling the renders, the concept drawings, mood boards, any of that stuff. And then we kind of tag teamed any presentations to the clients, site meetings, all that stuff. So it really was a good teamwork. Lucas and I had a pretty good thing going.
Cool. So yeah, full. So majority of the design development, and I know we're gonna like focus on like the
Yeah.
use of like technology to generate like imaging and renderings. That was in
Yep.
your wheelhouse. Yep.
Yeah. So it
Cool.
was an interesting role when I had swapped over to sales because, I was in design first. And in the sales part of it, it was, less of a supporting role and more of, face to face with the clients and, going to site meetings and all that. Um, and while it was a little bit of a shift, I still kind of handled the majority of my design um, needs just because it was, kind of easier that way. And I didn't necessarily want or need to bother the design team unless it was some specific things that they did help with some of the planting plans later on. But
Cool.
yeah, I handled almost all of the design portion of it.
Cool. All right. So what about? So now you're brought into the project. Um, I guess walk me through like maybe the first couple conversations or meetings with the clients that give
Sure.
some context on like what their vision for the space was.
Yeah. So um, our initial meeting went really well. We were given, or they basically presented their design packet. So they were handling obviously the architecture, the facade of the building, that photovoltaic roof I was talking about. Um, like they knew what they wanted for the rooftop, and they had renders of like the gardens and things like that. Yeah, they presented those drawings. A lot of the garden renderings that they had shown were um, very annual based. It
Mm-hmm.
was definitely something that was just to look, like this is the garden. That's kind of it. So, in conversations, it was, is this the look that you want, or was this more of a placeholder? And they were
When you
like,
say
oh, it's
annual based, I can picture what you mean, but like for our listeners, like what does that mean? Is that
yeah. So it was a lot of uh, flowers, a lot of
vibrant
flowers.
colors?
Yeah, vibrant colors, a lot of greens, and a lot of just very vaguely plant shaped items, So, um, and a lot of flowers too that didn't necessarily bloom at the same time were all shown, fully ready to go. So, um, and if that's the look you're going for, there's definitely ways to achieve it. But, there's a cost that is associated with that. So, um, our point of contact, there was, we were working with two guys from RAL. Um, Spencer and Jerry, who were great. And Spencer was a landscape architect, so he had a really great idea of kind of what we were getting into with the design, which
Okay.
made the process super smooth, enabled us to like share ideas very quickly without having to go super in depth right off the bat, which was really cool. We had a lot of great discussions about planting plans and layouts and species that we liked, and what kind of look we were going for. So in those conversations, we kind of shifted from that super flower heavy palette to something that was more multi-seasonal. That was kind of like the big push there was, we want, interest year round. um, so we shifted to a palette that had a lot of perennials and uh, like shrubs and stuff that would have great fall color, winter interest, even if people weren't going to be up there all the way. Just the roof kind of lent itself to be looked at from either side, and there's things about that too. So we kind of shifted more towards that kind of palette right off the bat. Um,
Okay.
yeah,
Yeah, it's interesting. So I feel like that's also connected to like the success of the project and the timeline when you talk about the client's experience. So what I
yeah,
mean is like, every client's going to present you with some kind of like vision, maybe very like detail oriented or
definitely.
very vague, but like some kind of vision, like, hey, this is what we have, this is the space, this is how we hope the space is intended to use, here's some things we like, now take it and design further.
Yeah,
But you had in this case, a client who was a landscape architect by trade, and
trade. Yep,
so that I think that helps the time frame of the project not needing to do, which without that you'd be doing a lot more education potentially on
definitely.
materials, and plant
Yeah,
product and
yeah.
stuff
Like
like
I didn't
that. Yeah.
have to explain why the full flower planting bed would have been
Yeah.
more money. Like that was something like, oh yeah, it looks great. I don't think that's really going to work for us with everything taken into consideration. The other cool part of that was that the rooftop essentially was designed when we got involved. Like they had
Okay.
the planter layouts, like where they wanted to have
Like where they
planters.
wanted the beds
Yeah,
and stuff. Yeah, yeah.
exactly. It was like how do I say
Got
it? It
it.
was
So they
kind of
had like
fill
the
in the
framework of
lines.
what the rooftop was going to look like finished. Now it's about putting materials, product, and plants into it versus
Exactly.
like, here's a flat roof, we want you to start from
Yeah,
scratch,
it
and then
wasn't a blank
that's going to be a
rectangle.
longer design
Yeah.
development process for
Yep.
sure. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It wasn't a blank rectangle by any means.
There you go.
They had like where so the garden itself had I think three like inset beds into the roof,
Mm-hmm.
so they were basically intended to be flush with the pavers, and then they had like a bunch of freestanding planters to kind of separate like seating areas. Um, so starting with those kind of bones, it was really about filling in with what the palette should be, um, but also and just to touch on a thing you said earlier, um, in the design process, there's always a lot of interesting things that come from like conceptual ideas. From clients, there's always these grand ideas that they want, and it's always the most fun part of the process for me is to start off like, oh, how do we make these things work? Um,
Cool.
and because it's some people have a very specific thing like, oh, I want purple flowers and I want, something in the winter. Like it could be as straightforward as that. While other people have more abstract idea of what they want. Like they want something grand or they want something traditional. So those are like the fun things to kind of wrap your head around. But one of the biggest things that I think influences design is the constraints, because you have to
Love
kind
that.
of find your path of how these things are going to work with what you're given. So one of the constraints here was the that photovoltaic roof cut off a lot of the natural sunlight to the main garden bed.
Okay.
Um, it's a beautiful piece of architecture and art, but that impacted what we could do here or there, as well as like soil depth, because they wanted it to be as flush as possible to the ground.
Interesting.
So you were limited on plant size and plant choice when it came to like shrubs and small trees and things like that. But again, just to touch on, like the client's experience, this stuff was all kind of known right off the bat. Like those are things we talked about in the first meeting. Um, and, being kind of put into this project a little bit later on the scale of, starting, we were able to kind of land on that stuff right away instead of, landing onto the design and then having like, oh, we don't have as much sunlight, or, oh, we can't even put these trees here because we're limited on depth. Like we kind of
Sure.
knew a lot of that stuff right off the bat, which was super helpful and made that project a lot more streamlined than it could have been.
Yeah, no, and it's again, I'm no like I'm hammering the same point, but like that education is either like an intensive part of the design and sales process or not, like, the
Yeah,
environmental conditions that you have in the urban landscape, or the structural conditions, like, are
definitely.
going to force, certain realities. And sometimes it's like like the customer already understands those realities, or it's like we just got to start with, like, all right, well, here are the
Yeah,
constraints that we're working with, and what they're going to, what kind of solutions they're going to force, and why.
exactly.
So that education either has to happen or doesn't. I love that point about constraints. And, because I believe that 100%. Like, I think constraints often breed creativity. Sometimes
Oh,
people think the
yeah.
other way. It's like, oh, like, classic thing is like, think outside the box, no constraints. And
Yeah.
like, that's going to come up with the most creative solutions, but not necessarily. I do believe, like, constraints really force like this pressurized, like, solution mindset, like, where like, the constraints can often lead to more creative and, even a higher volume of creative
Yeah, definitely. Because
options through
it
those
makes you think.
constraints.
It makes you think in a different way, you know. Because if you
Yep.
and I think back to like in school when you have a project, you're kind of free reign. You don't have to worry about budget. You don't have to worry about drainage. You don't have to worry about any of that stuff. You're kind of just like going with it, wherever your mind goes, which is
Mm-hmm.
great and it's super fun. And I think it's important to kind of learn your own creative processes in that way. Um, but personally, having those constraints definitely takes those ideas to next steps because, it's reality. You have to kind of wrap your brain around how do I get this fantastical idea, to work for, me, for the
True.
client. Um, and like you said, that's the stuff that makes you think out of the box. It makes you think like, oh, like what if we did this? It might not be the perfect solution, but it's a way that we can do it this way. It's different. It's something that people haven't really thought about before. Um, so it's like a puzzle. It's a really fun thing to do every day, and when you get all that stuff attached to it, it's just cool to see where you end up. How projects start and how they end are always, it's a fun evolution of things to see, from a simple sketch in a notebook all the way to seeing it like fully planted and grown. Um, and, too, when we're working on like, we work with live material, which is a whole other beast that I think comes to play a lot in the rendering portion of things because, I can render the tree the best way that I can. But, even if we get 30, you know, 6 foot tall dogwood trees, sure, they're going to
They're
be
all going to be the
similar,
same, right?
but yeah, they're exactly the same branching. But,
Yeah, yeah.
that's part of it.
Yeah,
So,
they're all
and
different.
it
Yeah.
depending on how you're going about your palette, that can influence things. So this one was more of a naturalized design. We were trying to echo more of a native, New York woodland in a lot of
Cool.
ways, where we had like a low, like kind of forest floor concept, and then like a mid-story, like forest edge vibe. But if you were doing a more traditional or classical garden, that stuff really matters. With like if you have, let's say 12 boxwood in a line, you need them to
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
match or as
Like
closely as
exactly the same.
possible.
Yep.
Um, so that's where the renders are. It's funny because you want to show the concept, but you also have to get the point across that it is a concept. It's there are going to be slight differences, and especially if you compare how plants are shown in the renders, which is probably a season or two grown in, versus how they'll be installed, because you have to kind of let things breathe and get into their flow. um, it's just interesting.
Definitely. And you're starting to lead into like some of the, the challenges or the things you need to consider with renderings, which is awesome. So let's go there. So I guess walk us through, you know, I don't know, as best as you see fit, like maybe the order or the timing of when you started
Sure. Yeah.
creating renderings
So
and why. Yeah.
we started again. I think we had a little bit of a kickstart in the beginning, just because of all the previous work that the client had done. Um, but after that initial meeting, we had started basically with a mood board. So just for people who don't
Cool.
know, a group of images that kind of get the vibe or idea that we're kind of going for. So our mood board had a lot of pictures of like the High Line as reference, a lot of multi-seasonal plants kind of in fall and winter, a lot of reds and greens and purples. Um, and that was kind of where we started. We sent that over to the client without anything else right
Cool.
off the bat. And they responded to it, said, this is exactly kind of what we were thinking. Like, keep going, which was
Cool.
super
It's not always
cool.
that easy, right? Because
No,
that's what you're looking for. You want a
yeah,
reaction, right? At this point, yeah,
exactly. And
good or
I
bad,
think, yeah, good or bad. And I
or
think that's
middle.
a really important point to make, because some people feel bad, like kind of criticizing or, you know, uh, putting in their 2 cents, but that's what we're here for, and
Mm-hmm.
bad, like if you don't like something, that's almost more important than if you like something, because it just,
Really good point.
it lets us kind of direct where we're going. So, we're not wasting our time, they're not wasting their time. There's no hard feelings. It's just we want to land on something that works for everyone and, is cool and exciting. Like, if you don't like one idea, that's fine. Like, we have plenty more to go with, and we'll be just as excited about the next one. Um, but
I think
yeah,
that's a
so we,
phenomenal point. Like, and I think it is like your role as the designer or the sales and design rep to ensure that you're making the customer comfortable to like be
yeah, to say
critical.
those
And it's a
things.
good thing for our listeners, like, maybe in other cities, like we I wouldn't say like we have to do that, but we're also in New York, we have a little bit more luxury because like New Yorkers culturally sometimes like aren't, they're not gonna hold
Yeah.
back. Like they're like
No.
pretty quick to like, yeah, I don't like this. Like, and
Yeah,
you're like,
no,
okay,
that's
good. Which
stupid.
is
But
good,
okay,
but
sure.
you
Yeah.
do, if your customer's not like that, like you do have to like
Yeah,
make them comfortable. Like, no, look, I want to know, here's a mood board. We're starting with like step one,
exactly. Yeah,
be
and
very
mood
critical. Like
boards.
there's going to be some things you like, some things you, why is this here? Are you kidding me?
Yeah,
Kind of thing.
and
And you want that reaction.
it's
Yeah.
also important to know, like, why don't you like that? Like, is
True.
it the color? Is it just a innate feeling that you have? Whatever it is, it's stuff that we can work with and move forward on. And that was kind of a big part of, I went to school for landscape architecture, so a lot of our projects, you get critiqued. That's kind of how the process goes. You pin up, you present, and then you kind of get pulled apart a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really good to kind of wrap your head around, like, oh well, I never thought of it that way, or because everyone has a different perspective, and especially with something like this, there's endless possibilities to take almost anything that we do, whether it's a simple like
Mm-hmm.
front planter for holiday plantings or whatever it may be. There's so many different routes to take. So um, as a designer, you have to be able to take criticism and move forward with it. And it's never in a negative way. It's just
Yep.
it's just working. That's how it has to be. It's like, I like this, I don't like this. But so yeah, we shared the mood board. We were on the same page, and then we were given CAD drawings, so like schematics with everything to
Yep.
scale, of the rooftop and the rest of the building. And they had put some notes that they had marked up on that initial floor plan. So they had marked all that up, and they had marked where they wanted their freestanding planters and how many people they kind of were intending to be out there at a time.
Cool.
So that was all stuff that they had thought through, like, oh, if we have, 5 or 6 groups of 3 or 4, like, will they all have a place to sit and be able to talk and, kind of have separation from each other? Um, so we had taken that marked up plan, and in Photoshop, I had done uh, the best way to describe it, I guess, if you haven't seen it, is kind of like this camouflage patterny drawing, very rough and abstract, but just to kind of get colors down on the page, and to start thinking about like planting layouts. Um,
What do you mean? So through Photoshop on top of the AutoCAD drawing?
yes, yep.
Yes.
So
Okay.
it was a
And we can post
2D.
it. Yeah, I'm just trying to, what, like you said,
Yeah,
like talk through it to visualize it, but we can also post like
yeah. I can definitely
pictures
send
later. Yep.
kind of some of the renders and packets that will
Cool.
kind of
So you're
talk
taking like
through.
their AutoCAD, or
Yep.
like sometimes we create
So
the AutoCAD of the
imagine,
layout.
a
Yep.
black and white schematic drawing,
Yep.
and then it's as if I only colored in planting areas on it,
Yep.
right?
Cool.
So on those planting areas, there were drifts of all sorts of super abstract colors, but just to kind of get an idea of how we were going to group plants together. So yeah, and I guess it is a little hard to kind of conceptualize, but it's as if
Yep.
you know, the pattern of it is really um, it's not like it isn't a planting plan. I guess I just want to get that point across. Like it's more about, at least for me, conceptualizing like, oh, if we do uh, uh, this organic swirl or wave of, let's say, heuchera, um, behind it then should be something taller, and maybe we want to match this color flower or leaf or foliage type with something like this. Um, so that is kind of always how I like to start my planting plans, because it's loose and it kind of just lets you try a couple different quick options um, to see what you like and what you don't like. Um, and then in tandem with that, doing the planting palette, which is basically narrowing down, this endless possibility of however many species you want to use to a group based on either based on a combination of colors, textures, and those constraints, like I said, are a big part of the planting palette. So this site was really unique because it is on a rooftop, so it gets very good sun. But they put this, photovoltaic roof above it, which is taking a lot of the sun, as it's meant to do. Um, so you have to kind of, and that even splits the main garden bed for most of the day. Um, so it was a fun little challenge of like, oh, well, some areas are going to get blasted with sun fully, but
Mm-hmm.
other areas are going to be almost in the shade the majority of the time. So
Cool.
you basically had to break this palette down into like those, I guess you could call them three zones, like full sun, full shade, and then kind of this middle ground of like plants that are hardy enough to kind of handle either
Either
or.
or.
Um, so yeah, so we were working on that planting palette and that general planting layout, um, and then we had, I think, presented that to the client, and again, because of their experience, they kind of got it right off the bat. We're like, oh, cool! Like I love these plants. I remember we had put in, I think in the mood board, one of my favorite plants was smoke bush. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's this really cool plant. Comes in purple, green, like a citron-y, like very lime colored green. It has an amazing fall display where they kind of keep their like flower head through the season, and it's like this little poof of dried leaves. But anyway, so in the mood board we had some smoke bush because it's just a really cool looking plant, and but funnily enough, the client um, saw it and was like, "Is that smoke bush?" I'm like, "Yeah." And he goes, "Oh, that's my favorite plant." And I was like, "Oh,
That's
no
all.
way, that's my favorite plant." So we put in smoke bush. So it's funny on the things like that, that people pick up on. But
Definitely.
yeah, so that's kind of where those first initial steps were, like the palette and the planting layout. And once we kind of got the okay on that, I had moved forward with 3D renders.
Okay.
Um, so this project was great because they had already made a 3D model for the entire building. So super detailed, shows all of the intrinsic nature of all the different floors, like plumbing, like, that rooftop thing I was talking about, that like screen, all stuff that is important and crucial to the building of it. Um, and when we are given 3D models, it's always nice because they have all of that detail. Like if we're making a 3D model from scratch, we're obviously not going to put in all that stuff because, that's not what we're trying to show you.
Mm-hmm.
But when we're given it, it's always great because it gives context to everything. You know what I mean? Like it's the exact
Sure.
door frame they're thinking of using. It's the,
Cool. It's
exact
more detail
pattern they're
oriented.
having. Yeah. So,
And I assume
um,
it saves time too, right?
yeah,
Versus
so
building
much
from
time.
scratch. Yeah,
So
yeah.
if I was
Sure.
to make that, model myself, it would have taken forever,
Mm-hmm.
and if I was to do it in my way, it would have only been the top floor. I wouldn't have had anything underneath it. The
Good
shade
point.
above the thing, I wouldn't have really shown that pattern that they had in it, so you lose out on a lot of that context.
That's a good
Which
point.
it isn't the end of the world, and especially with a client like this who kind of has their head already in that space, it wouldn't have been bad. But it's always great and preferable if the client has that model. So that saved a lot of time. Um, so we, get that model. I convert it into SketchUp, which is the 3D modeling program that we use the most. And for those who don't know, it's a planar based 3D modeling program, so you can kind of draw things in, you can push and pull. Um, it's super great. It's a little more user friendly than like AutoCAD can be in 3D or Rhino or Revit, but um, I digress.
Sure.
the
No, it's important.
We take that SketchUp model, and then SketchUp is essentially, you can imagine that the model is just all these bright colors, like nothing looks how it's supposed to look. It's just all to kind of show shape and form and spatial like layout. Um, so we then take that model, put it into this program called Lumion, which allows you to basically associate high like fidelity images of materials. So, I was able to put in like the concrete pavers, I was able to put in like the brick of the building. It becomes photorealistic very quickly. Lumion also has a wide database of 3D models of plants.
Mm-hmm.
So that is kind of where we went next. So they don't have necessarily all of the plants, like the exact species that we were
Sure.
using. So that's why that plant palette is super important. Just to show, like,
The
let's
reality
say,
of the pictures of the plants you're going to use versus
exactly.
like what images are in Lumion or
Yeah.
the
So
program you're
so
using.
let's
Yep.
say, like, I think we had witch hazel in the planting, and Lumion doesn't have a really great witch hazel like plant for us. They have like a 150-year-old tree, and if you shrink it, like, it still looks kind of funky. So I put in, I don't know, like an azalea from Lumion, but it's, a placeholder for the witch hazel. So um, that's kind of how that program works. But the
Sure.
Lumion's great. We were able to kind of
Can I ask a
fully flesh
question?
out.
Why?
Yeah.
So we're at the point you're developing 3D renderings. What was the reason you started with build or start with SketchUp and then bring it to Lumion versus just starting with Lumion?
The reason why we start in SketchUp is because Lumion itself isn't made to 3D, isn't made to build models, I guess.
Got it.
It's a rendering software, essentially. So SketchUp, you can think of it as SketchUp is like the bones. So you
Yep.
you make everything that you need in that program or CAD or whatever. Lumion can work with all of these, but you basically have to build all of the surfaces and everything that you're putting in off the bat. And then when you put it into Lumion, that's when you kind of put on those finishing touches. So Lumion's 3D database does have like a lot of indoor decor items. So in the same way that it has 3D models of plants, it has like cups and plates and trays and fancy chairs and things like that, because a lot of interior designers use it as well. So it's really, I guess it's better to think of it as a fully rendering software where you need a starting point to take it, and then you get to apply all of these filters.
Cool.
No.
So you're finishing the touches on in Lumion.
Yep. So we did those Lumion renders, and we kind of sent those over next, and there's some minor tweaks, some back and forth on, like, oh,
Yeah.
I
What are
don't
you
know.
hoping for? So you've gone from right like mood board to like plant layout on the construction drawings and palettes
Yeah.
to 3D rendering. What are you hoping to get
So
from the customer at this
yeah. So
point?
at
Like
this
react. Yeah.
point, we want either a "this looks great," like,
Cool.
price it out kind of thing, or if it's, oh, and most of the time there's always going to be something like, oh, actually, when I'm thinking about it, I don't know if I like that shrub there, like, I think we need to
Sure. So it
change.
readjusts the palette.
Yeah, so there were some readjustments, some species changed, and then we got the okay, and then we took that okay, and then moved forward with creating an actual plant layout based on the renders. So that is us going back to AutoCAD and then placing, um, I guess, for those who aren't aware, it's like circles essentially that mark
Yeah.
the, the gallon size of the plant, or whether it's, burlap, whatever it may
Like the
be.
specific type of plant and size in the
Exactly.
specific
It's
spot
very,
on the
yeah, very
landscape.
type A. Like, you have a circle, you have an abbreviation of that plant name, and then you lay out the entire space with where the plants are going to go. Exactly. So then this way, we're able to pull quantities for our estimating team of like each plant and what size they should be. We're able to pull quantities of like, let's say, how much soil we need and how much like foam buildup, um, things like that. So yeah, once it kind of goes from that like approved design point, it moves on to estimating, and it gets very detail orientated very quickly. Um, so um, we can have as many renders and planting plans and layouts as we want, but like I said, we're working with living material, and when you're on site, oh, the hookah came in and it's 3 times as big as it normally is. Like, oh, we
Yeah,
can't
yeah,
just put it in front of this, or else, so it's, there's always going to be some tweaks and changes that you do on site, and that's why it's always good to have someone, that's involved with the design process, or at least
definitely.
has that kind of creative eye, just to, because I think the plans are great to have, to do things, because it gives everyone like a concept of what you're working towards, right? But at the same time, you need to be able to find that like kind of breaking point where it's like, oh, it's not going to look good if it, in reality, with the stuff that we have and how it's going to grow, we have to change it a little bit.
Sure.
But that's what makes this process fun. In every step of the way, there's creative freedom, because you're working with all these moving pieces, um, and at the end of the day, it has to look good. So it's an interesting thing. And there's also a difference too between how it looks day one of install versus how it's going to look in a year, or how it's going to look
Sure.
after a full growing season. So there's all these things to take into consideration. But yeah, as far as renderings go, that was pretty much the process there. We had done maybe 2 or 3 renditions of Lumion renders, um, had sent them over. I think they had printed them out and used them for some marketing material too for the building,
Cool.
which was always nice. But yeah, no, it was a super fun project, and there's a lot of really cool stuff
How do
that
you
we
feel it
did.
came out in the end?
I think it came out really good. It was one of the first ones that I had kind of taken the lead on, um, through the entire process, so that
Cool.
was, it's just a really, it's always going to be a memorable one for me. And the space was so cool. Like, I can't really overstate how amazing the views were, and like the architecture of the building, and that roof that was over it was just so pretty and unique. Like, we didn't really have to do too much, so it was more about accenting like what they had already. You didn't want to
Sure.
overpower or compete with it.
That's a good
So
point.
I think I think it worked out really well, for what we were aiming to do. And after it grew in and stuff, I think it achieved that naturalized look pretty well. Um, but yeah, no,
That's awesome.
I was happy with it. It was definitely
It's
a
award winner
process.
too, I think.
Yeah, yeah,
Right?
I
It
think it
was.
won a
Look at
couple.
you, man. First
I
one taking
know,
the lead
right?
on.
I should have just stopped there,
It's
like
only going up
100%,
from here now. Yeah, I think it
Yeah,
was
no.
a National Association of Landscape
Yep.
Professionals. So they
Yeah,
won
and
an
it was
award.
actually in
2023.
I think Matt Wessel had shared with me. It was in an article too,
Oh, cool.
from I forgot where. It was like a more of a maintenance service kind of point of view, but it was really cool
Awesome.
to see. It was something I didn't even know what was happening, and then Matt was like, "Did you see this?" And I was like, "No."
I didn't even know about that. That's cool.
But yeah, no, super cool project, and I was ecstatic to use. It was funny, the client and I had a very similar um, idea of what plants that we liked too. So not only was it trying to match what the direction was, but also it was exciting that that direction just happened to line up with what I really enjoy kind of playing with. So there's a lot of cool plants that I use there that I always try to kind of like fit into spaces whenever I can, just because I think they're so cool and they might be underlooked. Um,
Cool.
but yeah,
Awesome, man. Now I just now shifting off of the like specifically this project.
yeah,
I think we kind of touched on some, but I want to make sure we're talking about that. Like, what are some of the challenges that you deal with when using, um, technology or renderings in like their
sure,
landscape development? The two that I kind of sense came up were like one, like, you start with maybe some imaging or renderings that they had before you even got involved, right? Which were
yeah,
used for like marketing purposes, that very like
yeah.
colorful rendering you're talking about, and then how do you like that creates a challenge of like bridging reality of what the landscape's what's gonna work, what's it gonna look like, what do they actually want.
Yeah, so I
Yeah,
think that first one is a big one, and especially, that's why it's always great to have like, the construction side people, like how they think about things too, involved early on, because there's a lot of times where, especially, I think this happens a little more in indoor than it does in outdoor, but it does happen in outdoor where it's like, oh, well, these renders show, let's say, this terrace shows a 12-foot tree, just in the ground, but you're on the 20th floor. It's like, oh, well, do you actually have we planned for this? Like, is there the depth
yeah,
there? Is there the structural support there? Because sometimes there isn't. Sometimes that's things that, like, either the original renderer didn't know, or
yeah.
they weren't given the
Or
parameters
does it
of what
even
they're
work? Like, do
actually
you
allowed.
want a
Yeah,
12-foot tree on a rooftop,
exactly.
which is going
And
to lower the longevity of how long until you're going to need to replace
yeah,
that tree because you're on a roof?
exactly. Yeah, so
Yeah,
it's those things,
yeah,
do happen.
sure,
I think too, especially, and I think it's an interesting thing to think about. But certain renders are better for certain clients, because those 3D model renders are great, but because they're so photorealistic, sometimes when you give them to clients, people feel like they can't change anything. They might feel like it's a little bit too finished and finalized,
interesting,
so it's a little harder to critique it. And it depends on the client too, which is it's always interesting. Some people respond better to more abstract or sketchy style things, while others need to see it exactly how it's going to be laid out.
sure,
So that's why I always like to stress, like, tell us if you don't like something, and we kind of touched on that a little bit earlier, but um, it's also about kind of feeling out how the client responds in, that initial site meeting, like, to a little more abstract ideas versus, like, you know, what do you want from us, before we move forward with anything. As a mood board, sometimes the mood board's good enough to move, you kind of skip a couple steps. Sometimes, the mood board's really just an opener for like the full scoped renders.
yep,
Um, so I think that's a challenge. I think too, and it might be the one you were thinking of, was uh, understanding that renders are conceptual.
okay.
Um, so, of course, we aim to have them be as close and accurate as possible to what we are looking to install. Um, but, we're not going to render how it looks day one planting.
Day one, that's what I was saying,
Yeah,
like, because landscapes
they
develop,
grow.
right? They
Yeah,
grow.
they're living things. So,
Yeah,
and if we were to plant it so that it looked fully fleshed out day one, a lot of things are going to die because they
yep,
don't have their breathing room, they don't have their space.
crowd each
So
other out. Yep,
it's kind of, you have to trust the process a little bit. But I think that's one of the coolest parts about what we do is, there's few things that you're designing that are going to grow and change and ebb and flow together.
yep.
And you never know what plants are going to do, really. Some
No, it's
plants
a really
might.
good point. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
true. And even your expectations of how they grow out through a season or two,
exactly.
reality
Yeah,
is some things naturally don't make it to, some things grow
yeah,
quicker, some things take a little longer to stabilize and take root. But yeah, that was definitely it. Like that education is really important, at least from what I was sensing from what you're talking about and what I've seen in, you're balancing, like you're creating these beautiful renderings to excite, and that's what you want to do. You want to excite on like what the potential
Yeah,
of your urban landscape can be in this unique space, but there is a reality of balancing, like how do you install things, like the feasibility of accessing a space and the size of material,
exactly.
to horticulture, like what's the appropriate amount of space you need to give plants and how much time
Yeah,
you need to give them to flush out, to also things like, well, sometimes plants just, they come in smaller or larger, they're never
yeah,
all,
and
they're
you
not
just
like
yeah.
widgets, they're not like all the
No,
same, right?
exactly. It's
um
yeah.
and you need to give it like a 1 or 2 growing seasons for it to really be like, all right, there it is, that's what the
Yeah,
rendering was,
and I think that stuff too. It's kind of back to that constraint idea. There's a lot of cool inspiration you can find in how things naturally work out.
True.
There's certain plants that I might not be so inclined to use until one day you're on site or you're just walking around the city and you see something, you're like, wow, like I've never seen it look like that before. Like, what did they do that made this work?
Yeah.
Or what didn't work on something that you thought was kind of a little more solid. There's always changes to certain things and how you kind of perceive them. Like right by me, there's this beautiful planting bed in front of the police station. They have like this blue shadow Father Gillis. It's like this really pretty silvery blue, and then they have some of these like purple, like elderberry plants near it. So it's a really cool color combo. But um, I noticed one of the plants kind of broke from its what's it variety, and that happens sometimes, but it was
Yeah.
really cool to see, like, in this blue and purple garden bed, all of a sudden there's this bright neon green
Yeah.
offshoot of a plant. And it was a really cool color combo, so it was something
Yeah, that's
that,
really
it's
cool.
like, I never really thought about that.
Completely impossible to plan.
Yeah,
Just
no, like,
like
how are you going to know that this plant's just going to stop being
it's gonna
variegated?
like revert back
Yeah,
to
like,
itself.
like, what are you going to do about it,
Yeah. True.
It's just life. So it's fun. It's nature is chaotic just by how it is, but that's what makes it so interesting and cool. Um, Even when we try to contain it, it's going to do what it wants to do. But I think that's kind of why we want these gardens and plants near us. It's kind of how life is.
That's
Um,
awesome.
yeah.
Definitely. Nice, man. Awesome. Cool. Before I let you run, I didn't actually give you this heads up,
Oh,
but I always close with I feel bad now. I always close with a final question.
sure.
So like I don't know if you might
All
have
right.
to be on the
Hit me.
spot, but it's not related to the episode, but I like to
Okay.
just ask our guests
Yeah.
because we love the work we do. But is there something you're particularly passionate about in your craft right now?
Particularly passionate about my craft. I mean, I think I'm really into the bioluminescent thing. Like I love that was kind of why I got into horticulture in the beginning, which led me to landscape architecture, was the idea of making plants glow. I think that's so cool.
Hell
And
yeah.
there's a lot of really cool progressions there. Um, and there's a lot of neat things too that I think people have just started to look at, like in fungi and stuff that have like a dim glow already. I think it's a really cool idea to try to think of like a garden to experience at night. Um, I think it's a really cool thing. I think we've have like aromatic gardens. We have like touch, like gardens that are meant to be touched and kind of walk through.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. I think it's going to be cool to see where things lead with that, and especially as we start to tie more into like infrastructure and like um, you know like plant-based alternatives to a lot of other things.
Cool. That's awesome, man. I love that.
Yeah.
That's all I got. I appreciate you taking the time to be on the John Mini podcast. I really enjoyed this conversation,
Yeah, it
so
was a
thank you
lot
for
of fun.
joining.
No, thanks for having me. I had a great time.
All right. Thank you to Matt for taking the time to walk us through this award-winning project. And thank you to all our listeners for taking the time to be here with us today. Listeners, if you guys have any questions, ideas for future episodes are always my favorite. Any constructive feedback, please email us at podcast@johnmini.com. And a big final thank you to all our clients at John Mini Distinctive Landscapes. You guys allow us to make our passion our profession. None of this is possible without your support and vision to bring nature to the places people live, work, and play. This episode is a wrap. I hope you guys have a great day, and be sure to find a moment in your busy day to cherish the nature around you.